the first chapter today. A couple different things I want to read to you anyways about Ezekiel chapter 1. You can go ahead, Chad. I think it should be. So, seek God in His Word was essentially what the overall lesson was from the overview of lesson 1 that we went to through Ezekiel, and then towards the end of this, of course, we'll have the second part of this. Go ahead, Chad, and bring the first point. I think should right there, and go ahead. All right, start right there. All right, so. Haley's wake-up call in the morning for work. We have an alarm. Now, 20, however many years of my life before Haley moved into my house, I didn't use an alarm clock. I just kind of woke up and just didn't really need one for whatever reason, even all through school. I just never used one. Would just wake up when it was time to wake up. I don't know how to really, just the way that I operate. I found out soon, though, Haley is an alarm person because that's how she woke up. And wake-ups became different for me, right? Wake-up calls are different. Now, Haley's alarm clock is usually set at whatever time that it is, but it's usually set 15 or 20 minutes, sometimes a half an hour before she actually has to get up, right? And then it's that snooze button several times, and then when the time comes to wake up, then that's when she wakes up. I think that's crazy, all right? And we have had this conversation a lot. If I'm going to set an alarm and I need to get up at 6:30, my alarm goes off at 6:30, and I get up, right? She has an alarm set for 6, snoozes till 6:30, and then gets up at 6:30. There's two different ways to do the same thing, but that's how she does her wake-up calls. Now, you can go on trips, right, and have the hotel sometimes will call and give you a wake-up call, kind of a common thing when we travel. And then, of course, phone rings at that time, the alarm goes off, a computer-generated voice says, hey, wake up, or whatever. Sometimes wake-up calls come in other forms, right? There's a variety of ways that we can get wake-up calls. Your boss may be telling us one or more of the mistakes that you're doing at work and kind of realize that, hey, maybe I'm not as good at my job as I thought I was. Sometimes we get woken up in the middle of the night. Of course, with our two girls at the house and in the bed with us still, sometimes they wake up sick, right? It's a wake-up call. It's an alert. Moxie's a quick thrower-upper. She gets gagged and she is really quick to throw up. So she'll wake up and know that she's going to do that, and she screams and kind of holds her mouth, and we know we got to get her into the bathroom quickly. And that's happened to us several times. It's just another form of a wake-up call. A couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, we had forgot that the cats were in the house, and usually we put them out. And at some point during the night, they managed to get into our room and got into a fight. And it woke me up in such a start that for like 3 hours, I was checking AFib on my watch. I thought my heart was out of rhythm. Like it scared me to death. Totally different wake-up call than we have. Child crying, animals prowling around. Sometimes we get woken up by a dream, right? You've had one of those dreams where you're falling and kind of wake up at the start, or you're in a fight or something, or you kind of wake up with that, or kind of the climax of the dream. Such was Ezekiel here, right? Such was Ezekiel. As we're going to see as we kind of get into the first part of chapter 1. Now, Ezekiel, of course, we've mentioned this, isn't really on the list of like best known figures. If people really kind of have any knowledge of him, it's kind of from the folks on dry bones, right, that we're going to see later on, rather than kind of the Bible. There's not really a biography that exists about the person of Ezekiel, but we do know that he's living in Babylon around 593 BC, and we talked about all that stuff over the last couple of weeks. And he's there with the other Israelites as well, who have been carried into captivity because of their sin and because of their disobedience to God. And he is there as well. Now, Ezekiel is the first prophet that's in captivity. All right? Some scholars and theologians are eager to discredit him and kind of picture Ezekiel as like mentally maybe not all there, maybe kind of a product of paranoia and some wild hallucinations. Scholars, though, faithful theologians see him as a faithful spokesman for God, with whom the Lord communicated to with some wild dreams, right? Some very strange visions. Visions that Ezekiel had here, or dreams, or maybe a kind of a benevolent term for kind of what he went through and what he experienced. Jacob had a dream of angels going up and down the ladder, right? Isaiah had a vision from God as well. Saw God on his throne as being high and lifted up. Then you might even say that Ezekiel had a nightmare, all right, or had at least something that was not quite as pleasant at first thought and at first sight to what he saw. Now, the book, as we see in verse number 1 of chapter 1, right, we know that Ezekiel, the book says here that at the end of verse number 1, and I saw visions of God, right? So Ezekiel was aware that what he was seeing was from God, but there was probably some, as we're going to see here once we get into what he saw, there was probably some thought and some pondering over what he had just witnessed, or what he had been revealed after it was kind of done, and you'll see why here kind of in just a second. There were some crazy things that happened, right? So we know who Ezekiel is, and we know that he had these wonder of God, these visions, and then he went through, as we're going to see in verses 1 through 28 here of chapter 1, literally went through sensory overload, which is just all kinds of information pouring in, and trying to process all of it, and then write it down for us to be able to read and kind of understand. It's really quite the interesting account that he had. Okay, so we'll just read down verses 2 down to verse 3. The 5th day of the month was the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. The word of the Lord came expressively unto Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river of Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was there upon him. So even in the midst of some, I'm going to use the word terrifying because of the awesomeness of the display of the vision. I don't necessarily mean terrifying as Ezekiel was like terrified, scared. He may have been. Even in the midst of all of this that we're going to read here in the next few verses, Ezekiel was very aware that God was giving him this for a purpose, right? And very aware there were specific reasons that God was revealing his wonder to Ezekiel through the next couple of verses, all right? So let's read verses 4 through 6 and see his vision here. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and fire enfolding itself, and the brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof, as the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. Also out of the midst, therefore, came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man, and every one had 4 faces, and every one had 4 wings, and their feet were straight, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. Verse 8. And they had the hands of a man under their wings on their 4 sides, and they had their 4 and they 4 had their faces and their wings. Verse 9. Their wings were joined one to another. They turned not when they went, and they went every one straight forward. Let's stop right there. Now, decided to go over Ezekiel, decided to study Ezekiel after doing and talking about some of the wild stuff in Genesis chapter 6, and this just went off like a light bulb to me, right? We've got to talk about this because this is super interesting. He's seeing all these supernatural things. Okay? So as he's looking, now we don't know that if he went into a trance, we don't know if he was sound asleep. We just know that he looked out and there was this huge wind, tornado-like whirlwind that was moving towards him. When I envisioned this, or kind of was thinking about this, I found some similarities here to the cloud that led the Israelites through Egypt, right? There was this huge cloud that kind of was just there in front of them. This kind of puts me in the mindset, a very similar type of thing, but it was moving down towards him as he was looking out off into whatever he was looking out off into, or God was revealing this to his mind, or whatever the case may have been. Okay? Not only was the whirlwind coming, but it was on fire, right? There was a fire that was there enfolding itself, and it was bright all around this whirlwind that was coming out of him. So much so that he could see amber, right? He could see the color of it coming out of the midst of that fire as the whirlwind was moving to him. All right, so this is just kind of how I envision this. Ezekiel is probably sitting somewhere or laying down, hands probably chained up, right? Because he's a captive. And they're on their way to Babylon. We see they're there around the land of the Chaldeans in captivity. Maybe they're on a break, maybe they're resting, maybe they're sleeping for the night, whatever the case may be. But he is woken up or mind opened or whatever the case is here to this whirlwind coming right at him, right? Like directly coming right at him. It's on fire. And if that wasn't terrifying enough, as this whirlwind gets closer, he sees some images, some creatures, some things that are in there as well. Okay? So the form of 4 living creatures came from it, and we have a description there of their forms as well. Okay? Had a human form, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. All right? Now, the 4 faces of these creatures symbolize a lot of things. And there are tons and tons of commentaries and accounts of people dissecting essentially all the parts, all the descriptions of what Ezekiel saw. Now, throughout history, these creatures, or just creatures in general, have symbolically represented certain qualities. Okay? Now, I've got something that I want to read you. Let me pull it up here on my other notes. So, as fantastic as these details were, just by reading it, kind of captures your attention and makes your mind begin to wander. You can immediately think about other places in scriptures where we've had some fantastical heavenly beings described to us, right? And as I was reading Ezekiel, my mind automatically jumped to the book of Revelation, right? Automatically jumps to the book of Revelation and what John describes in Revelation 4. So many of the details are the same, right? But there's also quite a bit of things that are different as well. So why then are the differences in a passage so clearly? Why are they the same? Why are the differences here? And why are we having these things? All right. So the exquisite detail lends themselves to a vivid imagination of the glory and majesty of God. Ultimately, here, if we lose the grand picture in light, fine-tuning all these details, and we're going to talk about the details, as you know I like to, but if we lose the grand picture here, we've essentially missed the forest for the trees, right? We can rightly appreciate all the details, and we will, and we'll talk about them, but we should always do so in service of a greater, more glorious picture. The identity of the 4 living creatures is a matter of particular interest. Their interpretation has widely varied. There have been philosophical suggestions, suggestions that the 4 creatures are the 4 virtues of justice, prudence, fortitude, and endurance, celebrating the type of life for which we should be striving. Some have suggested a more physical description, such as the four seasons, indicating God's governance over all of creation. Some have offered the suggestion of the four passions, fear, hope, sorrow, and joy, or even the four Gospels, writers Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Calvin suggests that the living creatures are the cherubims. Now, however one understands the four living creatures, the one thing that every interpretation should point to, regardless of what it is, because there's a million of them, regardless of what the interpretation is, the one thing that the interpretation should do is they should point to the glory of the one who sits on the throne, right? God is giving Ezekiel these details of all these interesting things to reveal to him that, hey, I am the one, right? My majesty is matched by none. The gods that your people have been following after for generations now can not even begin to lift a finger at the majesty and the glory of who I am. So there's a ton of interpretations left for us of what these four creatures are. In the grand scheme of the scriptures, it doesn't really matter as long as we know that those four creatures point to the glory and majesty of what and who God is. Now, we can understand the possibility that the four living creatures are spiritual beings, and their descriptions in Ezekiel is an accommodation to the world that Ezekiel lived in. Ezekiel is given a glimpse of the world beyond our understanding. He's trying to put it into words the best he knows how. He's trying to describe an indescribable experience. And so we shouldn't get lost a lot of times in the description of living creatures is a literal description of what these heavenly creatures actually look like, but instead a description drawn from the animals that would most capture the mind of the people that were reading this when Ezekiel was writing it down. Okay? Now, these animals are hybrids, right? That's what they are. They have all sorts of different parts. And hybrid animals aren't unique to biblical literature, right? There's a ton of hybrid animals in all types of writings all throughout human history. Classical mythology, full of these creatures, right? You got the centaurs, horse and humans. You have the minotaurs, bull and humans, griffins, the sphinx, on and on we can go. And these creatures serve several functions in the writings that they're in. But they are typically either quasi-divine beings deserving of worship in their own right. Okay? Or they are emblematic of the wild and untamed parts of creation. By contrast here, the four creatures, living creatures that Ezekiel sees, what is the sole purpose for these four creatures' existence? To reveal what? And to do what? To reveal and worship God, right? To show the glory of God and to worship God. That's the whole the reason for their existence. They are not to be worshipped in their own right, by no means. Nor are they wild beasts that need to be tamed. Their glory points, once again, to the greater glory of the one sitting on the throne. So when Ezekiel's visions arrive to the one on the throne, the language actually becomes even less definite than what it was previously. All right? If you will jump all the way down to verse 28 with me of chapter 1. As the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of the rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of what? Of the glory of the Lord, right? And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake. All right. So as we get more into this here in a second, the appearance here of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, all the descriptions are indefinite and vague. Ezekiel is given a glimpse of the glory of the Lord, and yet even then he cannot see it directly, right? All of this, the appearance was the likeness of the glory. He still can't see it directly, and he still has to fall down on his face because of it. Now, the description here in this is in marked contrast, to any of the religious systems of the ancient Near East. Okay, and it's purposely done so. Gods are regularly depicted on their thrones. Okay, and as we get into more of this vision here in a second, we'll see more of this. While their appearance was believed to be greater than any of their images, their earthly image was meant to capture a description of their reality somewhere else, right? We always see these gods on their thrones, and it kind of gives us, it humanizes them enough so that the people worshiping them can relate to them, but still understand that they are supposed to be a greater deity than what they are, all right? Anytime in Scripture, though, that God shows up to man, right? Think about Moses. We see here in Ezekiel. Think of Paul or Saul before he became Paul. Anytime the likeness of God comes to man, is man able to see the full glory of God? He's not, right? And there's always Moses had to just saw a glimpse, right? He just saw a glimpse and his face glued for 30 days, right? Ezekiel here, he just saw the likeness of God. Didn't see the full glory of God, just the likeness of God. He had to fall down on his face. Saul got some of the likeness as well, and he went blind, right? And then there's other instances where we don't ever see God revealing himself in totality to man because we can't handle it, which is a complete counter to any other Eastern or any other man-made religion. All of these other religions have their little g gods that they have symbols of and they have statues of, and it's all ways in which they can relate to not only the humanity of their God, but realize that this is a physical representation of what we can see, and it's just an image of a greater deity. Think about the gods of Olympus, right? There's always moments in which those gods come down to man, and then there's times there where there's interactions and they can see them. It's never like that with God. And it's done so purposely because it shows a contrast of God amongst every other of the false religions as well. The gods of the Israelites who they had been whoring after and causing them because of their captivity, those gods were real, physical, tangible beings who existed off somewhere else. By contrast here, in Ezekiel chapter 1, he defies the description. The best Ezekiel can give us is actually 3 steps removed from the actual thing. So let's get back into more of what Ezekiel saw. Verse number 10 of chapter 1. If I can get to it. As for the likeness of their faces, the 4 had the face of the man, the face of the lion on the right side, and they 4 had the face of an ox on the left side. They 4 also had the face of an eagle. Thus were their faces, and their wings were stretched upward. 2 wings of every one were joined one to another, and 2 covered their bodies. And they went every one straight forward, whither their spirit was to go. They went, and they turned not when they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like the burning of coals of fire, and like the appearance of lamps. And it went up and down among the living creatures, and the fire was brought out of the fire went forth lightning. And the living creatures ran and returned as their appearance of a flash of lightning. Now, as I beheld the living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth by the living creatures with his 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels and their work was like unto the color of beryl, and they 4 had one likeness. And their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel in the middle of the wheel. When they went up their 4 sides, and they turned not when they went. As for their rings, they were so high that they were dreadful, and their rings were full of eyes round about them 4. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them, And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Whithersoever the Spirit was to go, they went thither was their spirit to go, and the wheels were lifted up over against them. For the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. When those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up over against them. For the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. And the likeness of the firmament upon the heads of the living creature was as the color of the terrible crystal stretched forth over their heads above. And under the firmament were their wings straight. And under the firmament were their wings straight, the one toward the other. Every one had two, which covered on this side, and every one had two, which covered on that side. Their bodies. We covered that side, their bodies. And when they went, I heard the noise of their wings, like the noise of great waters, as the voice of the Almighty, the voice of speech, as the noise of a host. When they stood, they let down their wings. And there was a voice from the firmament that was over their heads, and when they stood and had let down their wings. And above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne, as the appearance of a sapphire stone, and upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness as the appearance of a man above upon it. And I saw the color of amber, as the appearance of fire round about within it, from the appearance of his loins even upward, and from the appearance of his loins even downward. I saw it were the appearance of fire, and the brightness round about, as the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness around about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face and heard one voice that spake. So, we've not even started chapter 1 yet, right? But what we see, though, is that Ezekiel is 3 times removed from the actual glory of God, and he still can't handle it. He is seeing the appearance of what is the likeness of what God actually is on the throne. So he is describing to us what appears to be there, and then giving us his description, which is removed from what the actual thing is, right? So he is 3 times removed of just the appearance of what God is, not even the actual full glory of God, just how God is appearing to him, and he still can't handle it, right? As we dive into chapter 1 more next week, because we've not even started this yet. We have to talk about wheels and spirits of wheels and things on the left and things on the right and stuff at the top and stuff at the bottom, eyes and wings and all these crazy things. And we're going to dive into all of it because I think it's going to be fun to do. But we never want to lose sight of the fact that even in the midst of all this craziness that's going on, Ezekiel is able to understand and is going to portray to us, the reader of his book, that God is revealing his glory to me to counter and to show how and why he is the supreme, the one that is worthy of worship, the one that has the ability to create all these things and to reveal all these things to Ezekiel, and that all these other religions and all these other gods that the Israelites have been following after can't even hold a candle to what God has the ability of. Our God is greater than everything, than anything that the world can possibly give us. What great things that we think we may be able to attain, what wonder and glory and majesty that the world may tell us that we can have through following whatever religion or following, none of it can compare to the one true God who sits on the throne. His glory is much greater. The wonder is much greater. There is no actual comparison that any of us can make to anything else than God. And he has created these things, and these things are doing very ornate. There's very specific jobs and stuff that these creatures are doing, and he's revealing it to one man who sits captive to explain so that he can explain to everybody else just why God is worthy of our praise. Why nothing else should capture our attention. Only the service and worship of God and the majesty and glory of what he is. This is just the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, right? This is just what God starts with to kind of, boom, laser in his focus on who he is, so that then he can now begin to reveal why he is worthy and why he should be worship with such care and such faithfulness in such totality in our worship should be towards God. Okay, and as we get into these creatures probably next 2 weeks. I don't want us, because I can get lost sometimes in the trees of explaining what I think this is and why God revealed this and why this wing is here and all this stuff. It's going to be, and we need to do that. And it's important that we do that, but I don't want us to lose sight of the maker and creator of what these things are and the glory of who God is. So Ezekiel here in just the first 25 verses got flooded with sensory overload, and he's trying his best to describe what he is seeing. And as we get into that description next week, we're going to be in sensory overload too, and we're going to see just how an amazing and awe-inspiring God it is that we serve, and why I think this is going to be such a good study for us to go through over the next few weeks here as we look into the book of Ezekiel. So, this first lesson wants us to go through the first 3 chapters. Okay, so we'll get there eventually. We'll have to get through this vision first before we can go anywhere else. And we're going to continue next week by looking through Ezekiel chapter 1. I would suggest you don't have to, but it's just in my nature to give at least something to do to help later on. I would suggest just kind of reading through Ezekiel chapter 1 this week, because just me, I've read through it a lot. And I got up here, and still sometimes I read, I'm like, what in the world is going on, right? And the wheels and spirits of wheels and the rings above the wheels, and the wheels are moving, the spirits are on the wheels, and just so much stuff. Just read through it a couple times this week so we can kind of familiarize ourselves with what exactly is happening in Ezekiel's vision as we begin to attempt to next week to kind of dissect exactly what is going on here in this first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for another opportunity and chance that we had to look into your word. And we pray, Lord, that as we go through and look at this vision that you revealed to Ezekiel, and we break it apart, Lord, in the way in which you'd have us to, verse by verse, of course, Lord, we never lose sight of who it was, Lord, who you are, and the ability that you have, Lord, to even create these things. And then give Ezekiel the ability to try to explain these things, and then give us, Lord, a chance, Lord, to be able to go in and try to relate those things in our own walk, in our own faithfulness, Lord, in our own worship of you as well, Lord. So we pray as we continue to move through this, Lord, you give us clear thoughts, Lord, and you give me clear descriptions, Lord, and clear explanations, Lord, so that we can get a full understanding of what you'd have for us as we move through this book, Lord. Pray for Pastor Rob here too as he comes in the next few minutes to use him this morning in a mighty way. Keep us attentive to the word you have through him as well. We love you, Lord. Thank you for all you've done for us. In your name I pray. Amen.